Good morning, everyone. I hope that you've been able to enjoy your Christmas, whatever it has looked like this year. Throughout December, we've been discussing a theme found in the Bible about light and darkness and exploring how God is the light that shines into our dark world. Now we've come to the end of the series and we're exploring what it looks like to live as a child of the light. So the passage today that the teaching is based on is Colossians 3:12 to 17. Here it is. So I'm just going to read this now. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you have a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since, as members of one body, you were called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Okay, now, as you might have picked up so far through the service, there's quite a strong clothing metaphor going on this morning. That image of clothing is key to unlocking this whole passage. You can see it there in verse 12. It's as it says, we are to put on certain virtues or characteristics as clothing. And clothing is the outward expression of ourself. They are what other people see of us. So when it talks about being clothed with these things, it's talking about our external application of being a child of the light. In other words, this is what we are to do. But it's very easy to forget or to miss entirely that these outer clothes, according to the passage, are supposed to be the result of who we are. To misread it like this. So here's another version of it that would be not a good or helpful way of reading it, where we just say to clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts and be thankful. Teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs. Now, it's very easy to miss those important parts of the passage that hold this together. But let's pay close attention to the way the logic in this passage is set out. This is not how we're supposed to read it. There's a contrast between something that God has done for us and what that therefore means for the way that we live. An inner reality and an outer reality. Look again at the bits that we've missed. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, and then forgive as the Lord forgave you, and since as members of one body you were called to peace, and let the message of Christ dwell among you richly. So it's an internal transformation that's on offer from God, and the outworking of that inner reality. Inner transformation leading to outer transformation, inner strength leading to outer strength. Without fuel, the fire goes out. And if you try to live this way without the internal transformation, it would be a bit like a plant trying to grow without soil and water, or turning on a light if you don't have any electricity. Or to follow on from the clothing metaphor, it's a bit like being a mannequin. Mannequins are really just clothes. There's nothing else really going on with them. There's no inner transformation, but authentic light living requires something internal as well. So don't be a mannequin. Instead, let's go through the passage and discuss what it might look like to live this authentically as a natural result of what God has done for us in the gospel. So I've identified 3 pieces of clothing that the passage talks about, and I've grouped them into these areas here. And we're going to look at each of these in turn and think about what they look like as a child of the light rather than as a mannequin. And these are selflessness, peace, and gratitude. Now, thinking about selflessness, if I were to put us back into gallery view on Zoom for a second, those of you using your camera, who do you think would be the very first person the very first camera that you would look for. Are you going to be looking for me? No, no, come on. If we're honest, it's ourselves, isn't it? It's like when we look at a photo, there's one person we look for first. I know I do this. In fact, I've had whole meetings on Zoom where I'm staring at my own face. I've had calls with people I actually really miss, but I spend the whole call watching myself. I'm a little bit worried that when face-to-face becomes normal again, we'll actually miss that ability to stare constantly at our own face. Can you imagine wanting to carry around a mirror with you just to constantly look at yourself? But I think what we see in verses 12, 14, and 16 is a radical focus on others rather than self. You see compassion and kindness for others in verse 12, humility, love for other in verse 14, helping one another collectively to be encouraged and to grow in verse 16. These are all impossible to do while staring at yourself. Interestingly, there is research that's been done into video conferencing, and the findings are that we are all indeed prone to stare at ourselves. We're just naturally inclined to do that. But also, interestingly, that it's actually far more exhausting to do so. In fact, it's part of what contributes to Zoom fatigue, staring at ourselves. Now, it's possible to hide that view in Zoom, and I know people using other tools who will try and position their own video off screen just to avoid looking at themselves. But there is also a deeper sense that we're focused on ourselves as well, on or off calls. And it's much harder to turn that off because if we're honest, in all we do tend to think of ourselves first. Now, light is quite an interesting thing to think about in this context because there's something very unique in the way that light relates to everything else. Did you know if a beam of light was to go straight past your eyes, you would be unable to see it? Light itself is actually invisible, but when it shines on something else, it reflects off of it and makes that thing visible. The beauty of light isn't in its ability to draw attention to itself, but it's in its ability to draw out that which is beautiful from something else. In the same way, the authentic clothing of those living in the light does not involve ego and selfishness. It does not look at itself at all, but instead focuses on others and helping bring out their best. I think we all know that that's kind of what we're supposed to do. But the way that we actually move towards having more of a life like that isn't just to try more. Ironically, just trying harder is a very self-focused way towards selflessness. It would be exhausting, and ultimately it wouldn't really work because it's external only. It's an external only version of what we're talking about. I mean, we can give in a very self-righteous way that makes us feel entitled and better than others. We could be kind in order to make ourselves feel better about ourselves, to encourage others to think we are nice people. We can act humbly by insulting ourselves when someone compliments us or something we've done, but really just be fishing for compliments and at a deeper level feeling very insecure and hungry to keep hearing their kind words. But none of these are how we're supposed to clothe ourselves. They ultimately come from self-obsession. The authentic love, the way to do this authentically is to know who you really are. The way to authentically love is to know you are, in verse 12, dearly loved. To know how vulnerable and in need of compassion you are, and yet how much you are accepted by God. That no matter how we feel about ourselves, we can have a deep sense of our worth and greatness from the gospel, and from that to then put on the clothes of love ourselves. Let's look at the next one here. So we're going to look at peace now, and which I'm getting from the end of verse 12 through to verse 15. There's gentleness and patience, in verse 12, bearing with one another and forgiveness in verse 13, and unity and peace in 14. Now, living peacefully is even more important during difficult circumstances when everyone is low because of restrictions and stressed because absolutely everything is harder in a pandemic. And of course, our limited communication with each other can lead to loads of misunderstandings. In the film Batman Begins, the first of the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, while setting up the next film, Commissioner Gordon talks to Batman about escalation of crime and violence, saying, "We, that is the police, start carrying semi-automatics. They buy automatics. We start wearing Kevlar. They buy armor-piercing rounds." Now, most arguments are exactly like this. They are an arms race. And obviously, I hope in your family, squabbles don't literally involve armor-piercing rounds, but it still follows the same pattern. You say something hurtful, the other says something worse, they begin to get irate, you get angry. The next thing you know, you've both gone too far. The current Pope of the Catholic Church chose to take the name Pope Francis when he became Pope, after Francis of Assisi. And one of the reasons he did that was because of the original Francis's attitude to peace. At a time when the majority of Western Christianity was seeking to escalate violent war, he chose to do something quite different, instead walking unarmed across a battlefield and actually successfully having a civil conversation with the leader of the other side. Sometimes seeking peace can feel like walking across a battlefield. Disarming makes us feel vulnerable, and it feels counterintuitive as well. But it's also exactly what we understand Christ to have done when reconciling with humanity. And again, there is an inauthentic, external-only way of doing this that still tries to maintain the upper hand, to smile and nod through the activity of forgiveness, all the while holding onto the knife and staying ready to have a dig when the opportunity arises. The external-only version of this might not be a shouting match. It's more likely to be a quiet, passive aggression, subtle resentment that builds up over time. And with many conversations being through a call, it's easier to smile and pretend you're reconciled, but then immediately drop off afterwards, call someone else to complain about them. Forgiveness is very hard if you are self-righteous, but ultimately, knowing your own need for forgiveness gives us authentic resources for letting go of hostility and instead beginning to walk across that battlefield and seek peace. Let me turn to that last point. And actually, to be honest, this is a really hard one to talk about at the moment. There's no shortage of difficult things that we're all facing. And I know some even more than others. And when we begin to think about the gratitude that this passage encourages, I think, and you can see that in verse 15 and the end of 16 and 17. But I think there's actually two ways we could approach this conversation, two ways I could now go on to talk. And the first way is to say, don't focus on what you don't have. Instead, focus on what you do have. I think that kind of contentment can be really helpful, and you do find it elsewhere in the Bible, but I don't think this specific passage is talking about that. In fact, it doesn't make mention of any things or circumstances here at all. So what are we being asked to be thankful for here? There's a song by Theo Katzman called All's Well That Ends Well that tells a story of an old man and a son who go through ups and downs in their circumstances. They have a horse who runs away, and the neighbors say, "Oh, sorry, what a shame. It must have been really expensive." But the old man says, actually, any moment can change. Months later, and the horse comes back with a lady horse who gives birth to baby horses, and the neighbors say, "Wow, that's amazing. What a fortune." But the old man says, any moment can change. Then one day the son gets kicked off the horse and breaks his back. And the neighbors say, "Ah, what a shame, he'll never ride again." But the old man says any moment can change. Now, their circumstances continue to fluctuate. A war breaks out and the son is excluded from a draft because of his injuries. He survives the war. But all of the other young men go off to war and are killed. Now, our circumstances will change as we live on this earth. Sometimes they'll be good, sometimes they'll be really bad. But Theo is trying to communicate in this song that actually our circumstances are all subplots in life. They're actually not the main plot. There's something bigger going on, and it's fine to find things to be grateful for in our circumstances. And I always really admire people who can do that in difficult situations. But ultimately, there's also something more solid to be thankful for that is totally beyond our circumstances, and that is the eternal love of God. I don't know if over the last week anyone here has happened to watch the greatest Christmas films of all time. I am, of course, talking about the entire extended edition of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Towards the end of the last one, The Return of the King, Sam and Frodo are in Mordor. They're in a very difficult situation. They're exhausted, they're tired, they're alone, and they're about to give up all hope. But Sam happens to see a star shining brightly through the clouds. Similarly, actually, if anyone was able to catch it, earlier this week, Jupiter and Saturn happened to converge in the sky and cause a particularly bright light to appear barely visible through the clouds. This was Sam's reaction to seeing a bright light through the clouds in Mordor from the book. There, peeping among the cloud rack, above a dark tor, high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Now, that light that is above and beyond our circumstances is something we can always be thankful for, no matter what is happening in our life. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to see beyond the shadows. But Christianity is not about having good things happen to you. And it's not about having everything in life lined up the way we want it to be. It's about finding hope, love, and a sense that all is right despite our circumstances. That as the world falls apart, it's knowing you still have something solid to stand on. As the day turns to night, it's knowing that you are still a child of the light. So let me just close then by summarizing to say that this light that we're talking about is the same light that gives us fuel for selflessness, that lets peace rule within us, and that ultimately we can be thankful for despite our circumstances.